Chairman of the Mount Vernon Historic Preservation Commission. I want to welcome you for taking a Saturday morning, or longer than that if you're going to stick around for this afternoon's activities. Just a little bit on today's activities. I'm going to give what is going to be turned out to be a little briefer talk than what I thought I was going to give on sort of window types and the background of windows, but I'm also going to cover some do's and don'ts of historic preservation. The reason we've expanded my part to include that is we're here to talk about windows, but some of you probably haven't been to our previous presentations and may be contemplating projects other than just windows. In fact, probably most of you are contemplating projects that go beyond just windows. So we want to cover a little bit on the do's and don'ts of historic preservation. We have an entire gamut of window activities represented today. We'll talk about maintenance of windows, but then we'll talk about replacement and repair of portions of windows. Then we'll get into component replacement, and then we'll talk about actually replacing windows themselves with entire units. And then some of what I'm going to talk about also, we'll talk about the design of windows in additions to structures. So that's sort of the gamut of what we're going to talk about. This afternoon, hopefully we have a couple of presentations on, actual hands-on presentations on restoration of wood products and this type of thing. So I think we've got a pretty full day. As long as you want to stay around, someone's probably going to be here to keep you interested. A set of bad news is that I have a great PowerPoint presentation I've been working on and off for a couple of weeks now, richly illustrated with examples of windows and Mount Vernons. That's the good news. The bad news is that my multimedia projector is hung up in Washington, D.C. at National Airport. It must be a security risk or something. So that's why I said my presentation is going to be somewhat abbreviated from what I originally planned on doing. But you will have an opportunity. I'll provide my CD with my presentation on it to Dean, and it will be included in the video portion of this, which will probably be broadcast on local access, and it will be available as a video tape probably in a month or two, whatever Dean gets to it. So we'll start about windows. Windows are an important aspect of the architectural character of a home, or a building for that matter. Oftentimes you have nothing but a plain blank structure, but a plain blank wall, but the use of windows and window types and window patterns can have a tremendous positive impact, or improperly done, negative impact on that elevation. So that is one aspect of windows, is the aesthetic aspect. It doesn't matter what type of window it is, it's just how big they are in proportion to the house and where they're placed. But more on a practical side, windows, of course, have been put in since history primarily for the purpose of providing light and ventilation. Early windows, actually some of the earliest windows we had were actually casement windows. The very, very early ones back in the 1600s and 1700s, the first time they came up with a window, it was a window that was hinged top and bottom and moved horizontally. Or only in the probably the 1700s and certainly getting into 1800s where the double hung window or single hung window become more prevalent. And if you drive around Mount Vernon, other than fixed units of a special design, you're going to see mostly double hung or single hung windows. And then something that's become more important of recent, the ventilation thing is sort of going away a little bit, at least in newer homes. We leave our windows closed year-round because we have mechanical systems that provide all the heat and air and movement that we like. But for an older home, ventilation is still a very critical component in windows as they relate to older homes. Egress, however, is still an important issue with regard to windows. If you have a blank wall in a bedroom and you have a fire, how are you going to get out? That window is probably the main reason. Building codes in this day and age provide some guidelines in terms of size and heights and all those types of things relative to windows as they're used for egress. Most of you who live in older homes have virtually no problem meeting any of those requirements. Your windows are far bigger than what are required by code to meet egress requirements. Now some of the windows in Mount Vernon, oh, that's a nice one. I like that. You can't see it. Oh, I'm sorry. I got to... Yeah. Actually, it was fun. I probably spent 2 days driving around, and there we have some great windows in Mount Vernon, ranging from the oval oriels with multiple divisions to Gothic revival type of windows, arched windows, circular, semicircular. There's a couple of neat, what I call eyebrow windows. You know, you see the roof plane sweeping down, all of a sudden it looks like there's an aberration in the roof that comes up, and there's a little window stuck in there. It's one of those things that until you go out and drive around town with the specific purpose of looking at what's there, you don't even notice it. And I've lived here for 25 years, and unless I go out and specifically look for a specific feature, you don't see them. I mean, I always knew that there was a Palladian window. That's the window with two rectangular windows on the side and a middle one with a circular arch on it. I always knew there was one of those on the Kepler house, but I found two others in town that I didn't even know existed. So it's, and until I went out with the specific purpose of taking pictures of different kinds of windows, I didn't know they were there. So just from a practical standpoint, the next time or even during the noon hour, if you want to go for a walk around town, you don't have to vary too far from our business district here to find some very unique windows. But anyway, we'll talk about the first thing you do when you have a window in an older house is you want to perform an evaluation of that existing window. First of all, is this an original window to that house? That's an important issue, because if it is, it takes on more importance than if it's a window that was installed in that house at a later time. Just because it was installed at a later time still doesn't mean that that's bad. I lived in an 1850s house out in the country. The original openings were still there. The front of the house, they'd replaced all the windows. They were a 6/6 mutton pattern, but somewhere down the road they decided it needed a sash replacement. So they replaced it, but they did put a sash of the same size, but it didn't have any mutton patterns in it. If you're going to do something like that window, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go back and replace that sash with a 6/6 sash. You're probably still better off taking that one that's there if it's in good shape and fixing it. But the two elements are, is it an original window of the house, or is it one that reflects, what could have been there in the original design? Now, we talk about divided muttons as people became more affluent and the process of manufacturing glass became more sophisticated. People wanted to get away from those multi-mutton windows. They wanted to have bigger windows. They had the same problems that those of you who have multi-mutton windows have now. It's a pain in the neck trying to clean and maintain those windows. But they do add a tremendous amount of character to the house. So part of the evaluation first is to take a look at what window is there. Is it original to the house, or could it have been in that house? Sometimes it's hard to tell just by looking at your own house. So the next thing you should do is actually look around the neighborhood. Typically, you don't see a lot of different styles in a given neighborhood. When someone developed a neighborhood, in our Ash Park is a classic area, but you don't have to go everywhere else. And I think the entire town of Mount Vernon, in about a 30 or 40 year period, most of our housing stocks seem to be constructed. And during that 30 or 40 year period or 50 year period, window types were very similar. So Mount Vernon, it's very easy, but those of you from larger communities, you may have several different styles represented in the same neighborhood, and for your particular house, you want to seek out another house of a similar style and look at the windows on that house, compare them to yours, and that's especially if yours aren't original. So be familiar with what's in your local area and from the style perspective. And as I pointed out earlier, remodelings aren't necessarily bad. I mean, you might have some of our 200 or 300-year-old buildings have been remodeled numerous times, and each time it was remodeled, it may have been remodeled to reflect the style of the time it was remodeled. That isn't bad. In fact, that's part of the history of a building. If you're going back in and doing some work, you shouldn't necessarily take the windows in that newer edition and convert them back to what the original windows were. It may not be appropriate for that edition. So that's another thing to keep in context as you're looking at a window. And the last one, which is a little harder to put your hands on, but is this a window an example of excellent craftsmanship? The craftsmanship in some of those older windows is something that, and nothing against you guys who are going to talk today, but I mean, the detailing in particular, I think the materials and things are every bit as good, but the detailing and some of the craftsmanship that went into some of those older windows, in and of itself, even if it's a plain window, may justify taking extra efforts to restore and save that particular window. But anyway, those are five things to take into consideration in evaluating the overall style of the window. Now the next thing, which is getting down to the more nitty-gritty, is to evaluate the the condition of the window. The first thing you do is take a look at the construction actually surrounding the window, not the window itself, but what's around the window. The biggest factor that contributes to the deterioration of windows is moisture, unequivocally. I mean, you have vandalism, you have insects and a few things like that, but moisture is a bigger problem than the rest of them all put together. The moisture could be coming from the window itself, but it may also be coming from other construction around the window. You may have a horizontal band board that goes around between the first and second story that has some problems, whether there's no drip there or there's a problem and water may be leaking in there, or the caulk joint around the edge of the window may be bad. So take a look at around the edge of the window first before try to locate the source of the problem before simply replacing the window. Otherwise, you put a new window in there, and if you didn't correct that source, the same thing's going to happen to your new window. Look at the condition of the paint. I see way too many windows, from my perspective, being replaced that really don't need to be replaced. They just got tired of painting them, or the caulk or the glazing compound is coming out. But paint is what protects that window. Very few of our windows today, unless you're getting a modern clad window, they weren't designed to be natural. The paint is the vehicle that protects that window from the moisture. A good paint job, even if you got a leak somewhere else, can probably take that window and extend the life of it considerably. Next is the condition of the sill and the frame. Other than sash themselves, probably the next area that is most subject to deterioration is the window sill and then the side, and we're going to talk about parts later, but the side jambs where they intersect the window sill, because where moisture most easily gets into the window is the end grain of the window, where it's cut off. You have that end grain exposed. It's just like a sponge in terms of trying to suck up moisture. So you have the sill itself, which can be a problem because water often sits on the sill, or the paint starts to buckle a little bit, and that paint can actually provide a dam almost to hold moisture there, allowing it to seep in. And then where the side jambs come down and actually hit that sill, underneath there is end grain exposed to the wood, and that's really an area. If you go around and look at a rotted window, that's where most of the problems occur. But that's still not bad. I mean, there are materials out there today that you can actually reconstitute and restore those things if they're not in too bad a shape. The sash, and there we're talking about the rails, the stiles, and the muntins, and if you didn't do so, you might want to pick up some of the handouts here, but this one is sort of an anatomy of a window, and Mark, I think, is going to show us a little bit about the window. He's got one here that we can sort of take apart and show you the different parts of it. That's the next part to go, especially where you have a side rail. Hi, Tom. Come on in. Especially where you have the side, the joint at the corner where the window sash corners meet, and also the muntin bars. If you have multiple muntins, because they are such thin components of wood, when they start to deteriorate, it doesn't take a lot of deterioration for that to become a problem. And glazing problems. Frank's going to give us a little bit of information on glazing a little later, but just because the putty on the window is cracked and peeling up, I mean, that doesn't mean the window has failed. It will fail if you don't address that problem, but it in itself is not a bad thing. Too many people look at that and think, oh, I've got to replace the window. Well, if you actually take the time and effort to take that, at the very least replace that deteriorated glazing compound, or better yet, pull the sash out and reglaze it. I mean, this is something you probably won't have to do for another 30, 40 years. Probably as long as you own the building, this is probably the only time it will have to be done. So don't use that necessarily as an excuse to actually have to replace the window. And last is the hardware. There isn't much hardware with the older windows. They had a can't remember what you call it now. Yeah, lock, yeah. They had a lock. From a hardware standpoint, on the old double-hung windows or single-hung windows, the thing that typically goes wrong are the counterweight system. That's where you have the big weights that are in the channels in the side of the windows, and then usually they had a cotton cord, which probably is broken, and the weight's sitting there at the bottom, or some of the more sophisticated ones might have had a chain. You can either choose to repair those. It's not that difficult. All you have to, the windows were usually designed to be accessible so that those things could be repaired. They knew that that cotton sash was going to, or that cotton cord was going to deteriorate and break over time, so they made the windows so those could be replaced. So you got a couple of options there. One is to replace them, or you can go the other extreme, which I did on my house, which is to actually take all those things out, and I filled all those cavities with insulation, and then I put a friction replacement rail on the side. But those are a lot of different options. I'm not going to talk about those right now. After you've done all that, you've got the overall condition of the window, and now you have to make a decision as to how you're going to address that. And the four approaches, well, number one is maintenance. Glazing compound that is peeled up or is cracking, paint, those are just maintenance issues. Those don't even get into window restoration. Those are purely maintenance issues. And replacing the glazing compound is something that has to be done probably once in the lifetime when you're in that building, if you're going to be there for 30 or 40 years. It's not something bad, but proper maintenance, those windows that are in your house should be able to go for another 100 or 200 years if they're properly maintained. Unfortunately, it's a tough thing. If you've progressed beyond the point of where minimal maintenance is required, now you're into a concept called what we call stabilization. Now you've got maybe some rotten areas on the window sash or on the sill, or the wood is just in very bad shape. In other words, it's been exposed to moisture long enough that it's curled. Now you're into a point of stabilization, and there's several products, and I didn't mention this. There's several products available on the market. One in particular that I've seen used. I haven't used it, and I don't know whether I could, but an epoxy compound called Abitron, which actually comes in a liquid form or a putty-type form, and you actually can mix that, impregnate into the wood, and the wood will be at least as good, if not better, from a maintenance standpoint than it was originally. I mean, as long as there's some structure left of that wood, this product fills in the voids, and it can be sanded and painted, and now you're into what's called stabilization. One of the things about stabilization and maintenance of windows, they're labor-intensive. They're best done by yourself because it costs quite a bit to have people come in and do this fundamental type of work. You can hire it done, but expect to pay for it. Usually little cost of materials and a lot of cost in terms of time and sweat and labor. If you've gone beyond that, now we're talking about actual parts replacement, not replacement of the entire area, but you may have part of that sill that is so rotted that it won't even take the Abitron. Well, let's, again, rather than tear out that entire window and replace it, take a look at taking a portion of that sill. If it's going to be painted and you do a good job of replacing a part of that sill, you'll never know the difference. Again, nobody's going to come up and walk around your house and look at every little detail of the sill and say, okay, well, that looks like they must have cut out a part of that and replaced it. Even if they did, so what? But now you're in the parts replacement, and this also can go in terms of the window sash itself. It may be possible to replace a portion of the sash, although that gets a little more tricky. When you get into these areas, you're probably outside of the do-it-yourself area. I would recommend, unless you're very adept at this kind of thing and have done it before, and now you start pulling in professional help. It's still a labor-intensive process, but it's probably always going to be cheaper than actually replacing the window. Next one would be component replacement. Now we're talking about something where you'd actually pull out the entire sill, or maybe you take out the sash, they're beyond hope, and now you replace the sash. And we'll get into a little bit about what you should replace those sash with a little later. And last is replacement. In other words, now you're taking out the entire window frame and everything and replacing it with a replacement unit. Fortunately, the window companies, and we have a representative here today, have become much more sensitive to replacement of windows than what they used to be. 20 years ago, it was a matter of, here's the window we have, you modify that opening to fit our window. And now they've gone to the other side, fortunately. Now they'll make their windows to fit the opening. And furthermore, you can get a whole multitude, depending on manufacturer. You can get true divided lights. You can get muntins that look like they're true divided lights. So the new window companies have gone a long ways in terms of providing replacement windows. Also, we'll have a presentation today from people at Adams Architectural Woodwork. They have another venue. There are times when it's even tough for Pella and people like that to make a window that for a historic building, and I've used them on the Hawk building downtown, even my building down here, and they've done several replacements, but that's another avenue, and they actually reconstruct build a window that may be almost identical to the one that was there originally. So those are two options when it comes to replacement, is having basically the old window, if you've got enough of it remaining, reconstructed, or you can pick a new window that is really much more history sensitive than their counterparts. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but this is sort of do's and don'ts for not only restoration projects, but also if you're contemplating additions and things like that. And most of this stuff is covered. Make sure you pick up one of these if you don't have one. This is our, we spent a couple years developing this. This is the design guidelines for the city of Mount Vernon. And this basically has do's and don'ts for every type of component you're typically going to encounter, at least in our residential areas, and also the commercial. Somehow we missed the college, but basically the components and the processes there are the same. So make sure you pick one of those up. What's left over here is a whole series of resources that I've collected or the Preservation Commission has collected. There's some stuff on historic painting. Most of you, if you have a house, you're probably thinking about painting it, or you should be, because it seems like that's a never-ending task. There's a couple of excellent periodicals. Old House Journal, of course, has been around for years. I urge you to pick up that. The Cornell Library has a complete the complete set of these from beginning to end. I also have them in my office, which if you would ever need them, I'd loan them out too. And then another resource, which is fairly recent, which is this one from Clem Labine called Traditional Building. They have two different ones, one for homes and one for commercial structures. But it's like a compilation of ads with a few articles in it. But if you wanted to know who makes restoration windows, if they have one on historic windows, they'll list in there 15, 20, 30, however many they can come up with, manufacturers for this particular issue of what they're trying to deal with, and they'll list the addresses, the contacts, the type of work that they do. And they've got these things from everything from light fixtures to plumbing fixtures. There's one of these that exists for almost the entire multitude of components you would have in a building. I don't know whether Cornell has this, but again, I've got this from way back. And then last, when I was at the Home Builders Show a couple of months ago, I had some spare time that I could walk around, so I went around and picked up a multitude of other products that I thought might be applicable for restoration type of work. There's some new woods that they're coming up with today. They're not woods, they're composite materials that are much better than what originally, the first plastic woods. Here is one that I thought was amazing. It can be painted. It comes in from 1x4 to 1x12 and in 5/4 up to 12 inches. But it's a uniform cross-section. It won't ever rot. It'll take paint. But there's some really good innovations being done in the area of new technology applied to materials. And also, I'm always looking for better fences. This is one of several catalogs in some of these woods. At first, when I saw the plastic fences, I was kind of, oh, this is great. And then after I saw about the second or third one, my opinions changed a little bit on them. I mean, they're shiny. The scale of them is a little bit big, and plus they're white. They're always white until they start to yellow. But typically, so I was looking for some of these other new materials that might be used, and I found a couple, three things. So again, during a break, feel free to come up here and look around at some of the materials. Again, I'm only going to cover the things that I think are critical. We're going to talk about additions briefly, non-structural elements. I think I'll skip the part on garages and porches because I think I'd make an excellent one for next year. We'll do garages and porches next year. When you're looking at an addition, there's two key elements. One is the scale and the other are form. And those are very elusive things to tie down. As architects, in theory, we're trained to be able to recognize what is good scale and what's form, and in theory, you're not. Well, that's not true. I mean, it's a value judgment, but practice helps. But when you're doing an addition to a home, for example, one of the things we try to do is say, don't build an addition that's bigger than the house. And even if it is a big addition, there are things you can do to it to bring the scale of that addition down. If you step it back, for example, 4 or 6 feet from the main massing of the house, that has a tendency to make it recede and bring the scale of it down. This is the part of the presentation where I'm telling you about it, but it's a very graphic. It can be much better demonstrated by graphic illustrations of it than without the PowerPoint projector. We're kind of lost here, so that's why I'm going to. Number one, that's why I'm going to hurry through this. Plus, I'm already at my time. In fact, I'm going to skip straight over to Windows. Because that's really what you're here to learn about today. One thing with regard to additions, again, additions, Windows and additions. I'll talk with things in context of Windows. When you're putting an addition on, if your house has double hung windows that are in pairs, for example, and you're putting an addition on, strongly consider using double hung windows and trying to put them in a paired pattern as opposed to a casement window with a 5 or 6 wide. These are very fundamental things, but most people, when they do something that's considered inappropriate historically, it wasn't because they did it on purpose, it was because they didn't take the time to consider what they were doing. So take a look at, all I'm asking you to do is when you design an addition or have an addition designed for you, take a look at it from the standpoint of here's the existing house, here's the addition. If that original architect or the original carpenter were to build this addition, what would he have done? There's a popular phrase out there. What would he have done? Yeah, that's but anyway, that's what would the original builder have done if he were putting this addition on? Would he have put big casement windows in when they had pairs or big double hung windows? Probably not. Even if the technology were available, he might have used casements in the original, but he would have used those also in the addition. So give some thought to that with regard to Windows. Height-wise, also pay attention to the size and proportion of the windows. There are some houses around here, I know the Freeman Swanson house is a classic one. It's got very tall windows, but they're very narrow windows. All right, when you're doing an addition, we did a porch addition there, and so we took the narrowness of that window and put it in one of the little porch additions. So pay attention to the scale and size of the windows. Just because they use double hungs there doesn't mean any double hung window will work in the new addition. Pay attention to the size and proportion of the windows. And there's also some flexibility there also. A double hung window basically, or single hung, looks like 2 big panes, one over the other. Sometimes it's not the same size. Sometimes you'll end up with a taller upper one and lower one, and those can be replicated in new windows. But it may be possible even to use a different window type. Awning windows, for example, you may be able to take a double hung window that has expressed as a pattern of 2 big windows and find an awning window, if you like an awning window, that's the same size that has 2 big panes. It may look the same from the outside, but if for whatever reason you need to have an awning, there is some flexibility there. Rhythm and pattern, again, we just talked about that. I guess I'm pretty much out of my time, and anything that I need to try to convey to you better, I really need my slides to do it. So since I was going to talk till 9:30 and it's 9:35, any questions on this overview so far? If not, I'm sorry.
So I got a question more related to the economics
Okay.
of window replacement. Is there a standard figure out there on payback if you put in replacement windows versus just maintaining the original ones?
Payback in terms of energy or
energy loss?
energy loss, that's probably, in terms of initial cost, let's just talk about raw cost itself. Again, depending on this evaluation of the condition of the window and what has to be done to repair it and whether or not you have to pay to have that done or whether you can do it yourself, in many cases you can fix that window for considerably cheaper than you can do anything relative to replacement. Now, let's just say you're all going to the point where now you do have to replace the sash. All right? If you're going to have to do something, that's one where you actually can make an improvement relative to energy efficiency. Because now I think, Fritz, both of you make products, well, I know you do. When I did my windows out in the country, I couldn't get insulated glass in multi-divided panes, but now you can pretty much get insulated glass in any size and any type of window. So if you're going to the standpoint of, if you've already made the decision you have to replace that sash, by all means use one of the more energy efficient window glazing types to do it. I don't know what the numbers are, but I know that that will pay for itself. And also, with regard to windows, the big energy loser, glazing is one of them, but once you've gone to double glazing, the other big loser is air infiltration around the edge. If you go on to the point on an old double hung window of, say, you're not going to repair the cords and the counterbalance system, then make sure you take that area and fill that area in with appropriate material, because you'll have a tremendous amount of energy come through there. One word of caution there, and I've learned this from experience, is they made some great products. I thought that they still are good products. There are these expansive foams. Be careful when you use those kind of materials, because they do expand and they continue to expand for a little while after you put them in there, and it's real easy to take the jamb of the window and actually they can exert enough pressure on the side of that window to bow it in. What I've gone to and what I've always recommended is fill the bulk of that cavity up with like a batt insulation, and then use the expansion material just for the very end, because that'll create pretty much an airtight gap. You don't need to have it fill up the entire area, but use a batt insulation and just use something to seal it for the last part. Frank?
Yeah, they do have a product on the market now, an expansion foam that stops at a certain point,
Does it?
so you don't have to worry about that expansion of the frame.
All right.
Yeah, they came out with that last couple of years, I think.
Yeah. It's very tough coming up with an economic, on single-family houses, pretty much very few decisions are ever made based on an economic basis. When you get into commercial buildings, it has to be justified a little more, but on single-family homes, assuming that you're going to do most of the work, I pretty much figure it's always worth doing.
I was told that Alliant Energy will give you a rebate of $20 a window if you put in high energy efficient windows. But do you know anything about that?
It wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
$20 as long as they meet the energy number that the
Does that apply to only replacement windows, or can a replacement sash that, say, goes from...
applies to replacement windows.
All right. So that's something where the architectural lobby hasn't done its job, because it shouldn't apply just to replacement windows. It should apply to any kind of a...
Well, the reason they do that, they want to make sure that the window that's been produced by the factory meets an air filtration number. And the only way they felt they could do that was if not in a kit, but an actual window.
Yeah. I understand it. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I understand. Again, we'll have opportunities to ask questions throughout the entire day, and I'd like to do just what we're doing now. If anybody has anything to contribute to the conversation, make sure you raise your hand. And well, I didn't really mean that. No, go ahead.
The National Park Service also recommends a couple of windows that consider something like interior storm windows.
That's true. Yeah, storm windows, which again, the problem is a package unit is much easier for someone without having to come out and totally analyze what's going on. It's a package unit is easier for somebody to say this meets our criteria, whereas if you're going in there and doing individual componentized work to the window, who's going to come out and evaluate that that was done according to the standards? Fred?
And I have preservation agreement with the National Park Service does not recommend interior storm windows, they recommend exterior storm windows in every case. And the preservation agreement also states most emphatically that that's the cost effective, quickest payback that you can do to any window. Hold that in the
Yeah.
hand that.
Wouldn't storm instead of any of the aluminum and
A wooden version.
And actually, were you? Do you guys make a wooden? Well, I know you make a wooden storm. Don't you make one that actually has a movable sash? Yeah.
we have a sample of it with us. You want to pick it up and a small one in front. That's a sample of
So it's a wood frame, but yet it has the glazing portion is actually yeah.
you're not 2 stories up, paint a sash out on the seasonal basis.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's the end of phase presentation 1. Next one is Tom Hall. This is Tom's birthday. Everybody wish him a happy birthday. How old are you, Tom?
There we go. Window repair is, as Ed says, is just labor. It takes some patience and observation to figure out how to do these basically simple tasks, but with a few tools, almost anybody can do it. I won't say anybody, but almost anybody. The techniques are not rocket science. The Egyptians were putting things together with mortise and tenons and dovetail joints many, many years ago. And when you actually look at a window and break down the parts, it's all quite simple, small pieces that anybody can deal with. I guess I just went to a lecture by Thomas More yesterday about creativity in the soul. And I was thinking about what a good public speaker this guy was, and I've been thinking about how to incorporate that into my little spiel here, and so I've come up with the idea of the Zen of window repair. and that's basically what it is. I mean, it's when you have a window that you've decided that you're going to tackle and try to repair, and you figured that, well, you know, worst case scenario, you'll screw it up and you'll have to hire somebody else to do it. You know, you have to let the window talk to you. You got to look at it from the inside and see where the problems are. I've seen so many people who have rushed into a project and they've done far more than they've had to do, or they've done just, you know, completely deviated from what the original window was, or the original what originally was there by the craftsman that did it. And this is a typical window that it's rather old. It came out of a house here in Mount Vernon. But this is repairable. It's just simple pieces that have to be replaced. This morning, I was late, Ed, because I was whipping these out on the table. So. I don't know whether with this camera, whether it's workable to have people come up and look at these pieces and the tools and okay, well, I think that's the way I'd like to conduct this, because I think all these, as you look at the window, it's all made out of the rather complex joints, but they are really basic. Down here, it's just a simple mortise and tenon that's open. It isn't even a closed joint. Here you have a modified dovetail joint. On this window, the pieces have been pinned together. And it's a really old sash because these are through mortise and tenons that hold the stiles in here, and they're wedged.
As opposed to what?
Well, as opposed to just having a mortise that would not go all the way through. This window gains extra strength because the tenon goes through and it's wedged so that there is structure holding the top and the bottom together. Okay. But with this piece, pulling the window apart is the hardest aspect of it, because it's really easy to break more pieces than not as you pull the thing to pieces. And with this, I can disconnect this joint easily, but this one, is in there really tightly and it's glued. So the thing to do is to look at this, and because this piece of wood's going to be replaced, you cut this joint in half rather than trying to pull it apart and risk damaging this mutton. So you'd end up with two pieces, but you can kind of put it together and take your measurements off of that and make your replacement part. All the stuff is done with really basic tools. Router is the only modern machine here. A router is, to use it for this, you really need a router table with a good surface to work your, I've seen some Sears router tables that are about the size of a piece of notebook paper that, you're just asking to get your fingers clipped to use it, because you're dealing with small pieces of wood and you have to work fairly close to the blade. So a good router table is a necessity. But here, to make these pieces, here you go. To reproduce those, I just made several cuts with the router to rough out what that profile is. Now this rounded edge, you could get a router bit that would make that cut, maybe. But there are dozens of different profiles and it's really hard to get a bit that will copy exactly what the profile is. So with these, I've just roughed out the square edges. And then from there, you could just take a hand plane to make that radius piece on it and bevel it off. You just take the plane and round over that edge, and then a coarse piece of sandpaper and finish off the job. It's like Ed was saying with doing replacement parts. Nobody's going to go up there and grade you on this. I mean, if it's close, it'll work. With that old piece, the hardest thing to do with that is the coping, coping is the cut that is taken so that one surface mates with another.
Keep in mind, we're talking about houses here in Mount Vernon. If you're involved in a capital restoration project, probably close enough isn't good enough. You got to be exact, right?
Can you get me a reference? But, okay. It's,
For some of us that wouldn't have those tools, is it possible to take that piece, like to the lumberyard, and have them do the cut?
It is. I would not say the lumberyard. Someone like me. It's what's the right. But the problem is that you're making such a small quantity, and it does. The one thing that is critical is accuracy. I mean, it takes a little bit of time and sensitivity to set up the machinery to do the cuts so that you have an accurate piece of wood to work with. And with the wooden parts, there is such a small amount of material in here. Do not skimp on buying good wood. If it takes clear white pine, it will pay back in just the ease with which it is to work with the stuff. I can't stress that enough. And there seems to be a problem. I'm not sure what it is. Maybe you have some clues here, Ed. With old growth lumber, it is much more weather resistant. Newer woods, they should be treated with a preservative, because for some reason the trees growing faster, they're much more susceptible to deterioration from weather. You're shaking your head. Is this something?
What kind of preservative?
Let's see. There's the material that they use for treated lumber. It's a copper.
There's a product that you probably want in this commercial that is not retail available, right? Wood treated coat on the front wheel. But just simply soaking it in mineral spirit and giving it a good lashing of boiled linseed oil will go a long, long way towards what you.
Really, that's
The EPA is cracking down on a lot of the chemicals used to preserve wood, so I can't tell you what the current status of that is.
it's Swenson's house down here. They've done an awful lot of restoration work, and they've had an awful lot of problem with the poplar that they've used on it. And I've talked to some different manufacturers, and they all say that treating the wood with a preservative is critical, and then a good coat of paint. I like to prime everything before I assemble, and then all surfaces will be covered. So that covers duplicating the profiles of the pieces, and then the actual joints are pretty simple. I've whipped these out, and I have purposely left the marks of the tools on here so you folks can get an idea of just what's involved. It is really basic. It takes a little bit of practice, but most people can master it well. For doing this mortise and tenon, I simply used a drill to drill out most of the waste so that it's easy. I would take a handsaw and finish cutting this, and then just a chisel to clean up the rest of it. And then the tenon is just sawn. A good quality back saw goes a long way. I guess, did I bring it? No, I guess I didn't. This is a small back saw. This is a dovetail saw. There's a larger version of this that's about 14, 16 inches long. And the brass back on it stiffens the blade so that the steel can be thinner and give you a finer cut. Then once they're in that state, just a wider flat chisel will clean up the surface. And then once that would be fitted, this is a good technique, is to put a pin in it. The joint would be glued with a weather-resistant glue, and then you can drill a hole through the joint and put a pin. And it's sort of gilding the lily, but I like to use hickory for the pins and just hand shape it. If you cut it with a plane or a draw knife, what it does is it's a faceted piece of wood, and when you drive it into the joint, those facets will lock that dowel in there so that it doesn't pop out, because that pin is going across the grain of the wood rather than with it. So as moisture gets in there and works, the wood will expand and contract a little bit. It'll actually work the pin right out. Well, if you just, yeah, if you just, and then this is the hardest joint, this dovetail joint. And still, I won't go there. But there again, it's simply accurate sawing. It's that.
Looks like that'd be a nice summer project for me.
Just this one piece.
Well, that's the way I always cut on the angle like that.
Okay. I was trying to get some of the product that Ed was talking about with the Avatron, which is a good product. I've used it on a couple of occasions, but it did not arrive in time, unfortunately. With this window and with like this I've picked out as probably a good example of what your windowsills are going to look like. This is an old piece of fir, and it's been out in the weather for a good 50 years, and the soft wood, the soft growth rings have just gotten worn away by the weather. With the Avatron, that is a really good product for this kind of application where you have structural deterioration around the corners of the windows of the sash or the window units themselves. I strongly suggest replacing the wood because it's a good filler, but I am really suspicious of its structural qualities.
Can I jump in on this one a little bit? My name is Fritz Miller, you'll be hearing me there. But we do commercial window restoration. And we've gotten completely away from Avatron for a number of reasons. The primary one is that it doesn't mix consistently. There's two parts. You grab a handful of A and a handful of B. You work them together, they make a paste. You go flying away at putting them in. That's not real scientific. And quickly you'll find that if you grab a little more of A and a little less of B, it'll set up quicker, or a little less of A and a little more of B, and it'll set up a lot longer. But the strength isn't the same consistency at all. And I have brought a sample, and I think you're going to love the stuff, called FlexTech, which is good for structural repairs as well as filler repairs, and which is a two-part, and it's a much more flexible. Avatron's big drawback is that it's very hard, and that means that it doesn't expand and contract at the same rates as your wood, which is why it's lousy for structural repairs. But the FlexTech is quite flexible, and I think that when you get to see it here, you'll become very impressed with it.
Well, for a sill, if it were just surface wear like this rather than rot at the ends where the uprights of the window meet it, because that's the common place where they fail because water gets down in that joint and it never dries. But with this, I would take a product that would be a thin hardener which would penetrate the wood, and it soaks into the cellular structure of the wood and stabilizes it, and then an Avatron, or what's this?
FlexTech, which also comes with a two-part conditioner similar to that, that is compatible, kind of like a primer.
Okay. Yeah, primer is exactly the word.
Is that FlexTech available in hardware stores?
No, but it's very available on the web. And actually, the inventor is so he lives in Vermont.
But then to take an Avatron type product and go over this and fill the piece of wood, smooth it out, sand it, then paint it, and you're good for 40 years? Let's see.
Are there some advantages to the stub versus this other one?
Well, I haven't really sat down and tried to figure out why they use a dovetail at the check rail, where this is the top portion of the window. But it is a traditional technique. And just thinking about it, it's because of the structure of the joint. Let's see. What it does is it prevents this piece of wood from being lifted. So I suppose as you're pushing up the sash, it adds extra structure there.
Given what it tended to do, it kept it below the surface. Does that give similar strength?
Yes, but limited, because in order for it to have real strength, it would have to be a good quarter, half-inch deep, so it shrinks the size of your joint. And let's see. Is there any questions you folks have? I think I've covered what I wanted to.
How old do you think that window is?
I think it's, I'm not sure. Maybe you could have
Real
better.
old.
Real old?
What do you mean by
It's an
real?
inch and an eighth sash, which means that it's handmade, and it's got handmade dovetails in the components, so it's, and plus, Mark and I were sitting measuring, the mutton's only a half-inch wide, which means that it's very old. Nobody did mutton that narrow
Really?
in a commercial milling application, so it was certainly made locally by hand, which is why its preservation is utterly critical, because you won't find handmade stuff like that very often.
This is, when I said craftsmanship, meaning, one of the reasons to possibly save a window, even if it looks like it's too far gone, this would be a classic case of something of that nature. This is probably definitely 1850, maybe a little before that. This isn't.
Settlement era.
What's the program? When you go around and evaluate, this is wood.
The Antiques Roadshow.
Yeah, this is the antique city hall show.
Talking about those TV shows, it's like, I think it's been really great that there are so many woodworking shows out there. It has tuned people into just the value of the craftsmanship, and it's sort of helped my self-worth a little bit here. But I do have issue with some of them because it's Norm particularly. It's like, unless there is a machine made to do a particular task, Norm does not do it.
Yeah, like the Woodwright shop.
Yeah.
You know who's paying Norm's All right, that's great, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Tom will be around to offer comment also, and we're off to a great start.